is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is entitled Adapted Physical Education. Our presenters today are Eva Kubinski, Takara Lovings, and Brock McMullen. It's my pleasure to introduce to you all three of them.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'd like to welcome everybody today. My name is Eva Kubinski. I'm from DPI, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to let us share and discuss around adaptive physical education. What we'll do is we will start with our presentation, and then we will answer questions. There is a question and answer box in your in the. I'm not sure, Bonnie, what I would call that. The
Moderators panel, yep.
The moderators panel, where you can put those questions in. So let's start by introducing ourselves. Takara, why don't you go first?
Good morning. Oh, is it afternoon? Nope, it is afternoon, officially afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Takara Lovings. I am the Health and Physical Education Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. My background's in physical education and adapted physical education, and I'm also certified and have experience teaching in health education as well. So I help Eva oversee adapted PE in addition to all other health and PE aspects for the state of Wisconsin. And I'm really excited to be here and present with you all today and to make the connections and to support you in the work that you're doing with your students, your learners, whoever you interact with that's a part of the public schools here in Wisconsin. And can't wait to talk to each and every one of you and just see how I can be most helpful.
Thank you, Takara. Brock.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon to all of our audience. My name is Brock McMullen. I am an assistant professor here at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I am currently in my 4th year in this role, where I serve as our director of our adapted physical education programs, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Before my time here at UW-La Crosse, I served as a teacher of adapted and general physical education. So I have experience working with kids with disabilities at all grade levels, K to 12. And I've really enjoyed my time here at UW-La Crosse helping prepare future teachers, both general and adapted physical education teachers, to go out and work with our K-12 students in the state of Wisconsin. And I look forward and I welcome any questions that anybody in the audience has, and I hope we have some good ones, and I look forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brock. And my name is Eva Kubinski, and I work on the special education team at the Department of Public Instruction. My background is in school psychology, but I've also worked at a federally funded technical assistance center in the late 90s, early 2000s that addressed many of the requirements of No Child Left Behind before I came to the department, and have had many roles and many hats, and one of them happens to be the person that's responsible for adaptive physical education. That being said, Takara is an amazing resource, as is Brock, and I rely upon them heavily. So I'm always feel very lucky that they're willing to take the time to be part of these presentations with me. A few things that I just want to mention regarding DPI. I want to remind you all that Wisconsin DPI has a stated focus on student equity. And what that looks like is that every student has access to the educational resource and rigor that they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, ability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income. And that's something that we all try to keep in mind as we do our work with you, be you parents or educators. Takara, the next slide, please. We also, as we begin, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction acknowledges and honors the inherent sovereignty of each of the American Indian nations of Wisconsin, both federally recognized and then one that is not recognized. Wherever you are in Wisconsin, the land we're on here for today's event is that of Indigenous nations who really have stewarded this land since time immemorial. And as in recognition of that, the DPI will continue to cultivate and maintain our ongoing collaboration and partnership with these American Indian nations, people, and communities in Wisconsin. And one way that we're doing that is through my position, which does include being responsible and being the contact for American Indian students with IEPs. So it's more than just saying we recognize it. We're really trying to continue and develop partnerships with our Indigenous nations and their communities. Next slide, please. And the reason that I mention that, because people will say, well, why are you doing land acknowledgements? And it is to recognize where we are and what the history is, but it's also, again, to emphasize that it's not just saying it, it's also doing. If you would like to learn more about the American Indian Nations of Wisconsin, we have many really great resources, many of which have been cultivated by David O'Connor, who is our American Indian Studies consultant. And you will see on this slide the various resources that you might want to try and access. So again, after the presentation, you will be provided with these, or you may already have them now, and you can investigate these yourself. So next slide, please. Today, what we're planning on doing is giving you an introduction to the components of an adapted physical education program, including the law, the common terms that are used, and what to look for in a quality K-12 program. Next, please. And in the federal law, just to get kind of, again, reinforce the basics, special education means specially designed instruction, and that's a very important term, at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability, including instruction conducted in the classroom, in the home, in hospitals and institutions, and in other settings. And I emphasize this, instruction in physical education. It's really important to understand that physical education is, and that physical education is not a special, it's not an extra. In the state of Wisconsin, it is a academic content area like reading, mathematics, science, that every child must be provided. When the student's disability-related needs interfere with accessing physical education instruction, adapted physical education is required. So next, Takara will explain some of the terms that come up.
We're going to look at a couple different terms, and some of these are, I think, more commonly heard or read about, and I hope that these definitions clear up kind of where each of those things fall, and many of these overlap, so that can tend to make it a little confusing when you hear a few words that sort of mean the same thing. So we're going to look at adapted with an ED at the end versus adaptive. We're also going to look at the phrase specially designed physical education. And lastly, we're going to go through a little bit about universal design for learning, and I'll refer to that as UDL in the future. So when I'm looking at adapted versus adaptive, so we have also an acronym, the APE, which means adapted physical education with an ED at the end. And now we definitely do see very commonly it written out as adaptive physical education, but the correct term is adapted. And here's why. So with adapted, we see that an activity, and in our case, physical education, that activity is being modified so that student with a disability and really any other learner, it allows them to have access to that curriculum where that learner can feel successful, stay safe, and also reach that point where they are feeling like they have a meaningful experience with that content area or with that activity. So we're adapting an activity to create access for that learner and to create safety and a meaningful experience for that learner. Now, adaptive, on the other hand, with an IVE at the end, we're looking at that term being used in terms of behavior and equipment or assistive devices that may be used as we are adapting an activity. We also see the words adaptive used when we're talking about age-appropriate behaviors and things that we do day to day in whatever ecosystem or culture or activities that we do on a daily basis, so that we can live as independently as possible and function as well as possible with daily life activities like getting dressed, transportation, following rules, safe food handling, all of those things that we do every single day of our life. Now, that has a very different application when we're talking about modifying an activity or a content area or an experience to increase access. So that is why adapted with an ED at the end is the correct term. Now, looking at specially designed physical education, this is a fun one because you will see this on the DPI website, especially designed physical education. You will also see adapted physical education, you will see APE, and in some places you'll even see adaptive physical education. That term is used currently in our state statute and also in our licensure area. So me, myself included, as a certified adaptive physical education teacher, that's an incorrect use of that term. So it's something that we could definitely become more consistent with. But the fun part of this is that specially designed physical education is adapted physical education is an APE. So they all mean the same thing. So as a parent, a caregiver, a community member, a learner, when you see APE, adapted PE, or adapted physical education, and specially designed physical education, you can know that they mean exactly the same thing. And this is physical education that has been adapted or modified to meet the unique needs of that learner in physical education. All right, so hopefully clearing up some of those, that those three terms mean exactly the same thing, but you still may see the words adaptive in some locations, but you can also know that that means exactly the same thing as well. Going to Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, another phrase that you hear sometimes used in schools or educational spaces, and you might be wondering, really, what does that mean? Really, what we're looking at is a proactive approach that considers the needs and the experience of the learner before engaging in activity. So there's a couple questions that you can ask, whether you're a caregiver or an educator, that allow you to make sure that you're taking that consideration into consideration when you plan and when you deliver activities, but also as you're just going through an educational experience. How am I following these guidelines and principles as I am trying to create access for students? So when we look at UDL, not to mention that the DPI, this is a big topic that we could spend an entire presentation on, but I think that adapted PE becomes a really great example of UDL and the guidelines. So you can check out more about UDL and some of the trainings and opportunities that we provide we have a different consultant that oversees UDL, because you can really dive into this and really see these guidelines and principles in action. And on the educator side, if you're looking to connect it to educator effectiveness, and if you're using the Danielson framework, there are some resources out there that help you do that. So we're looking at a proactive, very intentional design that increases the access to learning. And that's the goal. I'm thinking ahead of time and I'm planning as much as possible how I'm providing a very comprehensive, proactive, individualized at times set of content that creates more access for the learners that are in front of me. And this is all students. UDL is not a special education initiative. It is really an all learners initiative that each individual student has their own needs, and different guidelines and principles within UDL will help increase their access. Not just those that have a disability, where we have specific IEP goals around creating access or specific modifications that we know increase access for that student. So this is a brief visual representation of UDL, and you see the three principles there at the top. So we're looking to provide multiple means of representation of the information. So that's customizing it, putting it in an auditory way, putting it in a visual way. I'm also looking to provide multiple means of action and expression. So I might vary the methods that I'm getting students to look at information or provide responses to me, or I'm really optimizing assistive technologies or adaptive equipment that allow the student to express their engagement or their learning in that activity. And I'm also providing multiple means of engagement. So how is the student able to choose activities? How do they have autonomy over their experience? How does that student individually feel authentic in that content area? And how are they able to find value that's individual to them? And for especially students with disabilities, looking at the different threats or distractions, and I could even say barriers to access. How am I limiting those barriers or identifying those barriers that decrease the level of access that a student has to that content or to that activity? So I think on the educator side, I'm really going to ask myself these questions. How am I creating multiple means of representation, engagement, action, and expression before I teach that content, before I plan that lesson, or while I'm doing that? There is always room for that in the moment modification or reactive. And as we know, students arrive and come to us in all sorts of situations and all sorts of in the spectrum of emotions, and we may be adjusting on the fly as we go. So there's definitely space for that as well. Thinking about adults too, this is definitely something where you can think about working with educators or other parents, using UDL as a guideline for how you're proactive in delivering content as well. Equity and universal design is not a one-size-fit-all approach. So as you look at this graphic, considering that there still may be additional points under each of these guidelines that you have to get creative about. Think about that individual student, but really reaching out to your school about their UDL practices, their multiple levels of systems of support, and seeing how adapted physical education fits into those plans that they have for your school and your district.
Thank you, Takara. I did want to emphasize one thing, though, that UDL does not take the place of specially designed instruction. It's a tool for all students that may help your students with disabilities access the content, but if even with universal design they're not able to access it, then that's when we ought to also take a look at adaptive physical education. And so for this section, what we're going to talk about are the indicators of a quality K-12 school program. And since we get questions about who can do this, the teacher qualification certifications are Wisconsin's 860 supplemental license, which is no longer an add-on license as of the update of PI 34. There's also the certified adapted physical educator endorsement, I believe that is. And then also making sure that we're utilizing the tenets of a comprehensive special education evaluation. And we just released a bulletin about that, and we've been doing some initial training. We have a page on comprehensive special education evaluation that I would encourage you to look at, because it really talks about what we should be doing when we're doing the evaluation. And when it comes to whether or not a student needs specially designed instruction in physical education or APE, we want to make sure that we have that it's data-based decision making. We're pulling in information that we have, and we're not just saying we think they might need it. We want to take a look at student needs, not the label eligibility. And that should be part of what's done when you do the initial review of existing data, and just say, what are we seeing here? What are some things that might be happening? And then also we want to have ongoing progress monitoring, because again, if we're putting into place some kind of specially designed instruction and the student isn't progressing, then we need to come back together and review that. Next one, please. And Brock If you,
Yeah, so further indicators of a quality program is offering multiple placement options for students with disabilities. Adapted physical education is designed to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability in the least restrictive environment. And what this means is that they should spend as much time as possible and is appropriate based on their educational needs with their non-disabled peers. With that in mind, it's important to remember that adapted physical education is a service provided to a student. It is not a placement that a student is educated in. It can be multiple placements. So it's a service that can be provided in multiple placements where the student receives their education during the week, during the quarter, or the semester. But those multiple placements, again, are based on an individual basis for each individual student. These placement options can range from being instructed in the general PE setting with some modifications. Maybe the APE teacher shows up to the general PE class once or twice a week. Or potentially the student with a disability is educated in a combination of some in-class general physical education and then some pull-out sessions with their adapted physical education teacher. But again, these multiple placement options should be provided to all students. Therefore, all students who have a disability and qualify for adapted physical education should not automatically just be placed in a separate class setting from their non-disabled general education peers. So again, as much as possible, students with disabilities should be educated in the least restrictive environment. And again, that goes for all educational placements, including physical education. So therefore, as an adapted physical education teacher, we need to ensure that we are collecting proper assessment data, and like Eva mentioned in the previous slide, monitoring progress of students and their abilities towards their goals, so therefore we can determine what is the most appropriate placement for a student with a disability. And so after we determine the placement and monitor progress, we can then start to develop and work on IEP goals. So we go to the next slide, please. But however, going back a little bit to those various placement options, it should be noted that when students are educated in multiple placements in various educational academic topics, I should say, there will be collaboration, a good deal of collaboration amongst various special education professionals. And traditional practices within teacher preparation programs have focused on a combination of discipline-specific content and field-based work. However, future adapted physical education teachers will need to be working with other professionals within the school building to provide services to students with disabilities. It has been recommended that there be a shift in how universities prepare teachers so that there is a greater focus on hands-on practicum experiences, but also within those experiences, including interdisciplinary collaboration with other pre-professionals who will also be special education providers in the future. And those include physical or occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, special ed classroom teachers, and school psychologists, just to name a few. So you can go to the next slide, please. And one unique thing that we are actually doing here at UW-La Crosse is within our graduate adapted physical education program. In the last year, we have teamed and partnered with our graduate school psychology program to offer combined courses, combined content seminars, and combined clinical experiences. So our students in both of these programs, adapted physical education and school psychology, are now taking multiple courses together during their preparation period here at school. So therefore they can become familiar with what each other does in the school building, what their roles are, and how they work with students particularly. Also, we've provided different content seminars where we'll have guest speakers come in from various universities, various public schools, to provide students with information related to what some of their job duties and what to expect potentially when they hit the job force in a year or two. And then lastly, one of the most important things is our students in adapted physical education and school psychology are also working together out in the schools. So during their clinical experiences where they're spending time with their mentor school psychology consultant or their mentor adapted physical education teacher, these students are also working together to develop behavior management plans, to conduct assessments, to attend IEP meetings. And so our students, again, they are gaining these experiences, these necessary experiences in interdisciplinary collaboration, so that when they are working in the schools in a year or two, they understand the necessity to work together as a special education team to best serve students with disabilities. Next.
Okay, thank you, Brock. I'm just going to go through some things related to IEP goals and APE. I think one of the most important things to understand is that APE is specially designed instruction, not a related service. As such, the IEP team determines that if the IEP team determines that there's a disability-related need that gets in the way of the student accessing the content in a physical education class, it'll be important to develop a plan, a goal to address that need. And here's some of the information that the IEP team would want to examine as part of the goal setting process. We want to make sure that we're taking a look at what we expect that the student could reasonably accomplish within the school year. We also want to make sure that we take a look at the present levels of performance. And the purpose of that is to establish a baseline for education programming. So you also may need to have some narrative statements and then objective and measurable terms. If it's to say that a student will participate more in a physical education class, we need to know how much are they participating now? Are we saying that, right now they're participating maybe once a month because they won't stay in the room, and that's our baseline. And maybe our goal is to increase the amount of time that the student participates in a physical education class. And that would be something that's objective and measurable. You also want to make sure that you describe and discuss the effect of the student's disability on their performance in any area of education. And sometimes these may not be intuitive things. One story I share is that I had a student in one of my districts who just kept showing up in my office when he was having his physical education class. And as a school psychologist, I kind of started saying, something's not working here. And we did an evaluation. We determined that the sound of the basketballs and the students and their footsteps were echoing in the gymnasium to such a point that it was physically painful for the student. And so we did develop a specially designed instruction where he was in a smaller group, in a smaller gym. Perhaps they were in their socks and not in their shoes, and they'd use much softer balls that wouldn't make such a noise. And that was the way that we ensured that that student was getting access to physical education as opposed to my office. And then you also want to make sure that within that IEP goal is that you have information in terms of assessing what that student's at, and that could include standardized measures or informal assessments or test results. And then last but not least, we want to make sure that we're looking at the areas of needs, strengths, interests, and learning styles, which kind of touches base to one of the purposes of UDL, which again is not special education, but that does include a look at engaging the student and making them feel connected to the content. So when we talk about IEP goals, the elements of measurable annual IEP goals include by when's the goal expected to be achieved, who is the student, or who is going to achieve the goal, what will be done to know that that student has met that goal, what observable and measurable skill, task, or behavior will be achieved, and under what conditions, under what specific conditions, such as the environmental arrangement, degree of assistance needed by the student, or the testing circumstances, should the child perform the observable and measurable skill, task, or behavior. And then at what level of proficiency, at what measurable criteria performance indicates achievement. And then last but not least, we would put in there how we would measure that by. Who would be doing the measuring and what would they be looking at? Okay, Takara, what happens if there isn't a licensed APE teacher?
I love that segue. That's a great question, Eva. Yeah, I just want to say too on your last point on the last slide, which is that it's standards based, and thinking about adapted physical education is mirroring and modifying that physical education curriculum. So in thinking about what content I'm using for those IEP goals, I'm really looking to the physical education curriculum. I'm looking for that collaboration with the special ed department, with the school psychologist, with the physical therapist at your school, paraprofessionals, and that physical education teacher. And so it is really a team of people that help you collect information, form those IEP goals, and really that present level of performance for that student, to think about how you're making the modifications to the physical education content that allow that student increased access. And when you don't have an adapted PE teacher in your district or at your school, you're going to see some challenges with that process. The positive is that there are adapted PE teachers probably in your local area or affiliated or in connection to colleges or universities. And we know that with the state of education right now and hiring and staffing and funding, that it's not always possible to have that adapted PE teacher if you don't have one right now, you probably won't get one this year. If you do, that's awesome. The best practice is really to have that adapted PE teacher in your school or your district. But using the information that you have from other teachers and professionals and other stakeholders like caregivers, after school programs, whatever other information you can gather will help you provide some of those modifications or ideas. Any licensed physical education teacher can use their professional judgment to implement those adapted PE modifications. So according to our licensure area, if someone's certified in physical education, it doesn't mean that they can't work with students with disabilities. You are just looking for that adapted PE teacher and their area of expertise and training for assessment and the formation of those IEP goals and that ongoing progress monitoring. So we do encourage you to reach out to other people for that help if you do not have that adapted PE teacher in your district. I will point you to the letter to Tymosin from May of this year, in which a fairly common situation comes up when adapted physical education is attempted to be supplemented or replaced by physical therapy. And now that is something that cannot happen. And depending on your district, that may constitute a change in placement, which would require an IEP meeting and communication with the caregivers and student. So we cannot just switch adapted PE for a related service like physical therapy if you do not have an adapted PE teacher available in your district. So that can be a great resource to kind of walk you through a situation. But specifically reaching out to Eva or Brock or myself to discuss the specific situation that you have in your district, because there may not just be a general, guidance to give all schools as far as how to overcome that barrier. So reaching out to us will be a great idea to help you in this situation.
Oh. Okay, sorry, I lost the screen. Well, so in summary, what we've talked about today is that adaptive physical education is a service, not a placement. I want that if you leave, there are two things that I want you to leave with. That's one of them, that it's a service, not a placement. Especially in an initial evaluation, the IEP team should consider including the physical education or adapted physical education teacher to provide input. Oftentimes when I'm talking to school districts and talking about a student's evaluation, I said, so what happened when you talked about physical education? And they say, we didn't. And it's really important that you do, because again, physical education is a required content area. We have, in our state, we have specific number of hours of physical education that students need to attend in order to get what we're supposed to do in their education. So if we're seeing a student, and this goes back to that whole idea of comprehensive special education evaluation, where we're looking for students' needs, not necessarily whether they meet the criteria for a label. So then we want to ask about things like, well, how is the student doing on the playground? How is the student doing in walking down the hallways or participating in art class? What is the student, how is the student doing in physical education? To talk about those areas that might not just jump out us, and instead we'll think, oh wait, yeah, I was noticing something that might be related to, where they may need some help in physical education. The second thing I want you all to leave with is that adaptive physical education is a form of specially designed instruction, not a related service. That's why you can't have occupational therapy or physical therapy take the place of it. Occupational therapy and physical therapy are related services that provide support and assistance to the student so that they can access the specially designed instruction. So therefore, they cannot be specially designed instruction. And then again, what Takara just mentioned is that any licensed physical education can implement adapted physical education. However, the school district cannot pay for that time with special education funds. If they want to pay by special education funds, then they need to have somebody with that adapted physical education license. So that's kind of my summary. Brock, are there some things that you'd like to add just as we're completing what we've shared with the audience?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would just like to reiterate again is that adapted physical education is a service, not a placement. And that placement that a student is educated in should be evaluated and reassessed very regularly, and more regularly than just at the annual IEP meeting. So therefore, a particular student with autism, for example, may be successful in the general education environment during a particular unit related to physical education that deals with maybe more individual sports or activities. But maybe if there was a team sport or activity, maybe their general education environment, general education setting wouldn't be the most appropriate. So maybe for that particular unit, it would be appropriate to have that student with autism educated in a segregated APE setting with their adapted physical education teacher. And again, that's just one example that could take place. So ultimately, your school should be providing, or schools should be providing, various placement options for students with disabilities so that they can be making appropriate progress towards their annual IEP goals. And schools need to be showing that they are putting in their best efforts so that students can reach their IEP goals, which again is the goal of special education and adapted physical education, so that students can be as close as possible to their non-disabled peers in terms of grade level outcomes for academic standards.
Thank you, Brock.
You're welcome.
Takara?
I think the summary I would say too is just that there are people like Brock and even myself that are here to help and provide support and answer questions. And they're, Eva's your go-to for legal and compliance. And, we each kind of have our area where we feel really confident in giving support. And we are a team ourselves, even though we're not in the same team, department, or even location in the state. Institutions completely different, and I think it highlights the collaborative nature that education can and should be. So when you feel like, oh, I'm just like so alone in this, or I don't have the answers, or you feel like you're spinning your wheels, that's a great time to reach out to one or all of us about a question or a situation that you have. And I know for me, if I don't know the answer, I'm going to call Eva and ask her because she might know the answer, or I'm going to call
Same
Brock
here.
because So I think that, remembering that you aren't alone in this, and that when you feel like you're hitting that roadblock and you're feeling defeated or confused or just burnt out about this or other, education related topics, that there are people that you can reach out to.
Absolutely. If you want to, then let's check with Bonnie. Bonnie, do we have any questions?
And actually we do, and it's sort of a follow-up to what you're just all talking about right now. The first one is, my daughter is 15 and has autism, ADHD, and anxiety. She struggles socially and especially with loud and active situations. Physical education has been difficult for her in the past and has created conflict between her and other students as she tries to avoid it. How can I explain this to her IEP team, and what are options to modify her physical education? It has been difficult to ask for modifications when it's not, quote, a physical disability. She does well with 1 or 2 students, but not with a large group.
You've got the evaluator in me going, some kind of information might not have been collected. Takara, what do you think?
I'm looking to Brock and I can see his face thinking about
Yeah,
this.
I want to get a
Take
quick
it, Brock.
comment here before I forget. What really stood out to me in that question was, again, I'm paraphrasing here, but when somebody on the IEP team said, well, it's not a physical disability. And my first thought with that is, yes, physical education does focus on the physical development of students, but it also focuses on the cognitive and affective, or the social and emotional development of our students. And not every student that receives adapted physical education services is going to have a physical disability. Sometimes it might be a cognitive disability, or in the case of somebody with autism, more of a social, emotional disability. And so I would obviously state those points and talk about how that, yes, physical development for your child is important, but so is their development, their cognitive development, and their social emotional development. And if they're not able to develop those skills in whatever placement that they are currently receiving services, then there should be an adjustment to where those services are being provided. And maybe that's in more of a one-on-one setting, or like you mentioned in the question, in a small group setting. I'm not sure who those other students are that your child gets along with or works well with, but that could be something that is suggested potentially in the next IEP meeting, or to make an adjustment to the services being provided. And just potentially too, just thinking for other possible options, maybe implementing some sort of peer buddy system in the physical education class, so that way your child is paired with those 1 or 2 students that they seem to get along with a little better.
Yeah, there are a lot of different options, and we do sometimes forget the impact of students who have different neurologies than other people, and that doesn't necessarily just mean students with autism. And it can become a barrier to accessing content. But I think the main thing is to write down the concerns and request an IEP team meeting to discuss this, to determine whether an evaluation needs to be done or if there is sufficient data already. And if the district says, no, we're not going to meet with you, they should provide you in writing a reason why. And then you can talk to us and we'll talk to you about your dispute resolution options.
Okay, thank you for that. So it would be suggested too that this parent possibly follow up with one or all of you if she gets into trouble trying to advocate for her child.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The next one is adapted physical education services are required for students in special education from ages 3 to 21. Is that correct?
If the IEP team determines that the student requires physical education at those earlier ages, then that needs to be addressed. We often look at what is happening with their peers, and it's a question of, are their peers receiving physical education prior to kindergarten? Because currently, when we're talking about the requirements for physical education, and Brock and Takara, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's really more of a kindergarten through age 21 situation. And at the earlier levels, it depends on what's being done with their peers and what's their natural environment. Takara, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I was going to say I need to double check the statute. I believe if it's been identified for early intervention services, if adapted PE is on that IEP, then it must be delivered whether or not, I think that's another letter to Simonson, whether or not physical education is offered to the general education population. If it is on that IEP, it must be delivered.
And the same thing at 18 to 21.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
And so
Great.
ultimately, the most important thing, regardless of the student's age, whether they're 3 to 6, before kindergarten starts or post-secondary, the transition age, need to make sure that adapted physical education is on that student's IEP. And in order to get it on the IEP, there needs to be, go through the referral process, the assessment, the screening, to determine if there is a unique need for that student. And again, regardless of age, if it's determined that there is a need, that student should be receiving those specialized services.
And I think that you just answered the next part of that question. It was preschool and secondary level special education transition age students must receive adapted physical education, correct? So basically you answered that.
If the IEP team determines that it's necessary, otherwise we always go look back to see what are their peers receiving. And that's the minimum, because again, there are some ways in high school to substitute things for physical education. It depends on the district's policy, but again, it's the same way that if we're looking at a student with a reading difficulty, if they still need reading support and instruction past age 18, then that should be provided, whether they're in more of an in-community placement versus a full-time school placement. And it's an IEP team determination.
Okay, are you ready for another one?
Absolutely.
I've heard some school districts have effective motor team models where things like adaptive physical education, PT and OT professionals work collaboratively. How and when would this take place?
Takara, Brock?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, in a general sense, my response would be that, yeah, each school is organizing, whether it's like professional learning communities or sort of content-based teams within the district, of getting people that are sort of in similar content areas. So you may see social studies meet together, whether it's K through 5 levels, 6 through 8, and sometimes K through 12, so that they're able to look at sort of the overall scope and sequence, design, collaboration opportunities within those related areas. Not that APE is a related service, but they are related areas. So I would say my guess is that, without knowing more specific about that team, it's probably a grouping so that they are able to bounce ideas off of each other. Being that they probably see a similar group of students, they may use it as collaboration time or planning time for those students. But it would probably be one of those examples of a professional learning community.
Brock?
Yeah, just to build off that, those teachers and professionals should be communicating, I say regularly, and again, it may not necessarily be daily, but I would hope it would be, at least at a weekly or monthly basis. And especially they should be communicating, at or around the time of the IEP meeting when new goals are being developed and, there might be potential for a new formal assessment to be conducted, because a number of assessment instruments look at a combination of gross motor skills, which are done in physical education, and fine motor, which are skills maybe more focused on with the occupational or physical therapist. The APE teacher and those other professionals could potentially conduct an assessment together. And also when they're developing their goals for a student for the upcoming IEP meeting, these professionals should be working together to ensure that their goals are distinct, for their professional area, but if they are related in some aspects, they know about it, and so that way, maybe a physical therapist could help, work on a specific area that might enhance a student's ability to meet their physical education goal, their adapted physical education goal. And so, from the teachers that I've spoken to and regularly communicate with, a lot of times they might share an office with their occupational or physical therapist at the building, but whether they do or don't, they're regularly communicating with those other professionals again, I'm going to use the word regular basis because I can't say specifically how often, but often enough to where they're able to, plan units, plan lessons, and ensure that, what one person is working on is not a duplicate of what somebody else is working on, and so that their work can be supplemented and help enhance a student's performance and abilities in one area and another.
Brock, I'd like to add to that. The concern I have is talking about a core group. Again, I think it's good for physical therapists, occupational therapists, and adaptive physical education or physical education teachers collaborate when they're working with a student that requires all of those areas. We don't want them to come up with like a set program, because then we lose that part of being individualized. And again, if it may be that one student requires the related service of occupational therapy in order to access physical education, especially in physical education, but they don't require physical therapy, or vice versa. And so we want to make sure that we don't come up with blanket plans, because it's really important that whatever that does come up, that it's individualized to that student. And that's just, again, to make sure that we're not coming up with, if I look at the IEPs for a group of students from that school, if they're all looking the same, that would be a concern.
I have another question for you. What would you recommend a parent to do if they don't feel their child in special education is receiving appropriate and meaningful physical education? Can they request an evaluation for specially designed or adapted physical education services? And how soon should that happen?
Actually, what they should do, what that would require, would be triggering a reevaluation. And within that point where they do the review of existing data, that would then be where you would look and see what you had related to physical education and whether more data needs to be collected. But that shouldn't just be for that one narrow area. That would also be how are things going in any other areas that they're receiving specially designed instruction in. And again, if you get the opportunity, the special education evaluation bulletin has a lot of addresses a lot of those points directly. Takara and Brock, if you want to add to that.
I would also just ask the questions, ask it when you request an evaluation of your child. I would also just ask the teacher, ask the adaptive physical education teacher, what types of assessment instruments are you going to use to evaluate my child? And they should know what are the appropriate assessment instruments based on your child's age and ability levels. And then lastly, the next thing I would ask is, are the goals that you develop for my child, are they based on, are they standards based? Are they appropriate for my child's particular grade level? And those are, again, those are two questions, whether it's an assessment instrument and if the goals are standards based, that the teacher should be able to answer and provide you with information, again, based on your child's ability levels.
Yeah, building off of what Brock said, I think that looking at those standards-based goals, but the word that is jumping out for me from the question is meaningful experience. That how are the IEP goals and those standards-based goals creating a meaningful experience for my student? We know that physical education is really rooted in the foundation of building gross motor skills and the application to lifelong activities. However, there are 4 additional standards areas, and those are focused on the cognitive development of the knowledge and understanding of those skills, the enjoyment, enhancing the health of that individual. So there are more standards-based areas other than, can you shoot a basketball? Can you run for a certain amount of time? That skill development may not be the top priority for you or your student, and you should advocate for, I would say, at least the expansion of focus towards those other standards areas.
Okay, and I just have one other comment to follow up on something that was discussed before, and that's the area that Brock brought up about APE and psychology and the program that's available at UW La Crosse. It seems as if this is an area that has been definitely forgotten during the course of when we talk about adaptive physical education, and I think that the writer here definitely believes that there's a value in coordinating both of these areas, especially as people are going through, the children are going through the grade levels, and also in transition age as they're going to be having to live on their own. So Brock, I don't know if you want to speak to that area a little bit more, but I think it's a great area to look at.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I appreciate that comment from the participants. And the last thing I would just say is, I would hope many schools, or all schools that have any sort of teacher preparation programs in relation to special ed, prepare their students with an interdisciplinary focus in mind. And so whether you're a special education classroom teacher or you're wanting to be a speech and language pathologist, you should be working and becoming familiar with what those other school-based professionals in special education are going to do and what their job responsibilities are. So that way you're not learning about what all of these other professionals do during your first, week or month on the job when you're working in the school. So you're already prepared going into your job about what these other professionals and what their responsibilities are and how you fit in relation to their job duties. So thank you for the comments, and yeah, we just hope that this program helps prepare better adaptive PE teachers and school psychology professionals.
Takara, could you please put the resources and then our contact, those 2 last slides?
Yep, I messed up the screen share, so I'm going to go back and try to get
Oh,
that
okay.
switch back around so that the resources are up. One
Well,
second, please.
When you receive the PowerPoint after, or if you have it now, the last 2 slides include a series of resources, including the Center on Disability Health and Adapted Physical Activity, which Brock directs. It also has a link to just the Physical Education for Children with Disabilities Bulletin, the link to Takara's physical education page, and then the link to the specially designed physical education page. And these are all resources that, again, are kind of just the standard foundational ones. And then if you go to the next slide, here's the contact information in order to contact Takara, Brock, or myself in terms of our email addresses, because sometimes it's easy to become confused about requirements. I know I really sometimes just need to get back to something in writing that I didn't write to make sure that I'm making sense. And that's why, but it's also helpful sometimes just to problem solve and figure out really what's going on in terms of the program for a student, be it your own child or a child that you're teaching or supporting.
Well, at this time, I need to tell everybody that it's our 1 o'clock bewitching time, and we'd like to thank the three of you for your presentation today. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that those who participated did the same. So thank you, Brock and Eva and Takara, for your participation and your presentations today.
Thank you for having us. It's much appreciated.
This will conclude our webinar for today. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars. And please check out our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that you may be interested in. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, thank you, the three of you, and thank you all for joining us today. Be safe and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.